a poet, mainly. I was born in Missouri in the Ozarks, and actually a part of the Ozarks in southern Missouri that really reminds me a lot of southeastern Nebraska, Indian Cave, that sort of area. And so I began, I lived there when I was very young, until I was, pre-teens. And I lived in the Pacific Northwest for a while. So I've always lived in places where there was a lot of land, a lot of rural area, a lot of, I had a connection to the outdoors and the land, and it figures in my work a lot. And I'm just getting used to Nebraska. I think I've been here 15 years now, and I think I'm about ready to start writing about Nebraska now. William Stafford, wonderful American poet, used to always say, when asked, when did you start writing poetry, he asked, when did everybody else stop? You know, the idea that children all make up stories and sing songs and make up poems, kind of in their heads, even if they don't speak or write them. But for me, I guess it was college, and like many students, I went to college with one idea of what I was going to do, and this was in the late 60s and early 70s. And I thought, well, I would be a wealthy but socially conscious lawyer. You know, I would crusade for social justice, but I would also make lots of money doing it somehow. You know, it wasn't very clearly thought out in my mind what I was going to do. But I was a pre-law student, and I took a poetry class from a poet in Portland, Oregon. I was living at the time, a poet named Henry Carlisle, and a wonderful poet who had been a student of Theodore Rutke's. In that class, he read a poem by James Wright called A Blessing. And it's a simple poem about two men who were driving along on their way to Rochester, I think, and stop and get out to kind of pet these two horses. And he describes it in very beautiful terms and ends the poem, "Suddenly I realized that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom." And I just sat there with a big stupid grin on my face saying, oh, I know what that feels like, you know, when a moment like that happens. And gosh, this must be the most wonderful thing in the world to be able to describe it and explain it. Those words cannot express moments, but he can express it. This is wonderful. And Henry looked up from reading the poem. He would read all these poems to the class, and he looked up, and there I was with a big stupid grin on my face. And after class, he asked me if I thought I wanted to write, and I did. My first collection of poetry ever published was what we did after rain. And it's a lot of early work, but what I'm really proudest of is that it was done by the wonderful fine press printer, Harry Duncan, who worked in Omaha many years and has published many great American writers. Robert Lowell's first publication was Harry Duncan's press. Just a wonderful history. And so to have my first book come out published in a fine press edition by Harry Duncan was a wonderful thing. A completely different sort of approach for me was a little chapbook. And the publisher wanted something that was unified. And I had done a piece of poetry from straight research However, the research was on tattooing, and it was before tattooing was popular or had its recent resurgence. And it was called Art, Sex, and Mystery, A History of Tattooing by Christopher Scutt and William Gotch. I'll always remember Scutt and Gotch on tattooing. So I had a chapbook called Tattoos, and they all in one way or the other or another had to do with, you know, some side of life, some cultural habit or something that was in some way, I don't know, seedy. And the like. So Tattoos was the chapbook. My typical collection will have something about the weather in it, I think. What we did after rain. Skies of Such Valuable Glass was another collection that was done. And then I began thinking about doing this nonfiction and doing a memoir. And it occurred to me that, well, there might be a couple of essays in it.
Art Homer is reading some of his poetry and prose. Called one of the best younger poets writing in America today. Art Homer was born in Ellington, Missouri, and spent his childhood in the Ozarks in the Pacific Northwest, places we find reflected upon and experienced in his books of poetry and prose, his books of poetry being Tattoos, Skies of Such Valuable Glass, and What We Did After the Rain, and his latest book, or his memoir, A Drought Boy, an Ozark Tale. His poetic voice is described as simultaneously severe and compassionate, and Art Homer skillfully and provocatively creates art out of the aspects of life, whether extraordinary or mundane, that I think most of us are afraid to broach. As a result, he has seen his poetry appear in many nationally respected literary magazines: the Prairie Schooner, the Southern Poetry Review, North American Review, Poetry, Mississippi Review, and Poet and Critic, just to name a few. He has also received many awards for his writing. For his poetry, he has received a National Endowment of the Arts grant. And for prose, his memoir, A Drought Boy, was a finalist in the Associated Writing Program's 1993 award series for creative writing. Mr. Homer has also received a fellowship from the Nebraska Arts Council. Before Art Homer came to Nebraska in 1982, he studied at Portland State University, where he received his bachelor's, and at the University of Montana. Here he completed a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing as a Bertha Morton Scholar. In addition, Mr. Homer has headed such publications as the Portland Review and Cut Bank, and has served as editor for the Smoke Root Press, and currently he edits the Nebraska Review. Since 1984, he has been chair of the Writers' Workshop at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where he still teaches today. Please welcome Mr. Art Homer as he reads his selections of poetry and prose from new and old works. Thanks.
Thank you. Good job. I've been here a little over 15 years now, so I feel we can be informal. I feel like I can start to call myself a Nebraskan, and so it's just us Nebraskans here, so we'll be. I'll read a couple of early pieces from my first book, which I was very proud to have published by Harry Duncan for Abattoir Editions, who recently died after a long and distinguished career as an editor and a publisher and a fine press printer. This is the first sonnet. I'm going to begin and end with sonnets. It was never something I thought I would do. I write kind of long free verse poems, even long lines and 30 or more lines long. And I never thought the sonnet was really the form for me. But I started writing them in graduate school. And They imposed a discipline on me that I lacked otherwise, and being kind of wordy. And I found that every once in a while I need to subject myself to that discipline. This is called A Child's Fear of Numbers. To judge the height of trees, I'd find my own, compare the length of shadows for a scale. The way the missing piece fit what was known was just the way light draws a triangle. I don't know what it taught to pace the pear tree off across the yard. I'd forget more important things, the rule for square roots, or how the neighbor kids got beat. When I was 4'8", my favorite trees were always over 40. Maybe I learned something's not quite perfect. Even leaves can't forget their origins. To try this exercise yourself, think how Rule 1 says none of this will work without the sun. And on the theme of childhood, this is a poem for my daughter. A slightly more upbeat poem than Weldon Keys's poem for my daughter, if you know that one. I do have a daughter, and I want one. I even have a granddaughter, and she's wanted too. But this is a poem about a time, an experience with my daughter when she was about the age my granddaughter is now. For my daughter. There is rain in the sky, Willow, also clouds and blue stuff we call just sky. No other name for blue above, and no other name for willow. Ah, my little tabula rasa, I'm afraid what to write. Let's steal some old word and make it sweet again because you never heard it. I say orange, you injury, me soliloquy. We are about to be lonely. I mean lovely, sure. We can wipe the sky clean too. You can tell me again how the moon gets inside the clouds. It blooms in. No other word for it. Bloom. And the best line there, of course, was stolen from my daughter, shamelessly. I had taken her for a walk, and she asked me, how does the moon get inside the clouds? And I said, well, of course, honey, it doesn't really get inside the clouds. You know, it's up here, and the moon's way down there, and the clouds are over there, and we're over here, and it just looks like it, right? So you can see that, right? She said, sure, it does, look. So I said, okay, how does it get inside the clouds? And she said, well, you know, you know how a flower blooms out? Well, I think it just sort of blooms in. I said, okay, walks over, Daddy's got to go home and write now. Well, in this room dedicated to Nebraska authors, I'd like to read a little bit of the memoir. It's a chapter called Water, and it begins with a quote from Lauren Isley. If there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water. Its least stir even is now in a rain pond on a flat roof opposite my office is enough to bring me searching to the window. A wind ripple may be translating itself into life. I have the constant feeling that sometime I may witness that momentous miracle on a city roof. See life veritably and suddenly boiling out of a heap of rusted pipes and old television aerials. I marvel at how suddenly a water beetle has come and is submarining there in a splatter of green algae. Thin vapors rust, wet tar and sun are an alembic, remarkably like the mind. They throw off odorous shadows that threaten to take real shape when no one is looking. End quote. The trick is to be looking at the right time. Some trick. Watch the moving pool too long, and the spiral effect dulls your vision, but look away, and you may miss the moment. Of course, someone is always looking. Tree, water beetle, algae, and keeping record. About the time Isley was writing this, I was keeping lookout around the cistern for doodlebugs, watching the woodland pond at the bottom of our draw for pollywogs. Rafts of frog eggs hung around a flat rock that offered better access to the water than the muddy banks. They were balls of jelly clumped together, organs, eyes with thousands of slit irises staring. I pulled them out to dry. Despite parental warnings, young boys are drawn to water. Ponds, creeks, and wells are the street corners where a country boy can hang out and learn about life. My mother warned me away from the cistern and would have been horrified to imagine me creeping over the old boards to peek down the well beside my grandparents' house. I had heard one could see stars reflected in the water, but all I saw were the stone sides of the hand-dug hole graying off into darkness. Down in that darkness lies most of the water in the Ozarks. Not satisfied with having sculpted the surface of the land, water honeycombs the limestone underneath it. By freezing and thawing the upper soil layers, it covers cleared fields and even the bare spots under the pine trees with chert. I also looked with my father's help down an abandoned well at a dime of water, nothing but sky on its face. When the cistern went dry, we used the well a quarter mile from our house at an old home site on the Vales property. Both sources needed either boiling or purification tablets. We let the clay settle out of the cistern water before adding chlorine. The well water was clear, but brackish, probably a trapped layer of local water seeping down from above, rather than a true route to the underground rivers. The abandoned well was one of many signs of former inhabitants. Like the slate tablets my father's generation used at school, the land's erasures were never absolute. An abandoned orchard stood a half-mile north of the Vales well. I often dug up artifacts in our yard, pieces of cast iron from an original settler's stove, tableware. Once I unearthed a butcher knife and practiced throwing it at tree trunks, sticking it in the ground. My father built me a swing for my birthday, hung with brand new rope from a blackjack oak. I enjoyed it for only a part of an afternoon before my brother, 5 years younger, woke from his nap and demanded equal time. He went to tell my parents, and I remember his look of triumph running back across the spring grass to tell me my mother had said I had to share. Something old and buried inside me surfaced then. Sharp flint, patent medicine bottle. I don't remember throwing the knife, but how it sailed through the air in its high, slow, tumbling arc. Dave froze. Time became like leaf shadows on the gray-white dust of the path. I must have been 8. I called to him to move. I thought of my parents running down this same path, perhaps 2 years before, clothes and sandwiches bobbing in a pillowcase tied to the end of a staff. They were leaving home. I had threatened to run away, and they reasonably concluded I would be better off at home, so they would leave. As they packed, deliberately as the knife now twirling through the May sunshine, they talked about what they would do when they were free. I don't think they actually sang "Free at Last." They did skip, hand in hand, down the path, through the gate, and down the access road, through the trees, almost out of sight before I started screaming for them to come home. Maybe I screamed. Dave didn't. He didn't move until the knife stuck quivering in the ground, perhaps a foot from him. Then he unfroze, turned, and ran howling for the house. I got the most memorable spanking of my life. Over my father's knee, staring into the dirt, him sitting on the new swing. The flesh grows warm. The legs begin an involuntary jerking. Some mother load of guilt keeps you from wanting to ask for mercy, but pride, remorse, terror are not enough to keep the words choked down. You will never do it again. You will never do anything like it again. My father was silent. Even my brother was subdued, as later I lay across my swing, contemplating my fate in the wash of light across the ground. Okay. I was saying earlier, a friend of mine, Bob Skank, who read here about a year or so ago, gave this as an assignment to a composition class. Everybody write about a spanking. One you know about, one you remember, if you were ever spanked. The only time that I've ever, gotten up in the middle of the night, that old cliched thing, gotten up in the middle of the night and had ideas going, had to go write them down. And I wrote a little outline that was going to be a short essay about my childhood. And I remember I wrote, I remembered a little bug, the doodle bug, the little antlion that makes the little, we called them doodle bugs in Missouri. And there'd be a thing, a number of little chants or spells you'd say about the doodle bug, Johnny Doodlebug, back up, back up. And they, of course, they run around, they go in, they run backwards, and they'll squeeze themselves into your hand, and into, between your fingers, because they hide in crevices. And so I remember doing that, and it seemed like, well, the doodlebug got into the earth, got into the land. It would be a way into this story, And then, and as you went down into the land, there was a big, actually, this one of the Divis guys told me, he said, the farmers here in Nebraska recently, I was talking to him about some land there. I said, well, that farm doesn't have any water on it. He says, yeah, but I know a water witch that'll find you water. It's the best water witch in 4 counties, and so people rely on these local talents. As I got to thinking about that, I said, water witching, yeah, a lot of people don't know about that. So I wrote doodlebug, water witching. I wrote a little arrow, and then I thought, and then I had a story about, and somehow that related to a story about a mule. And then the story about a mule related to something else, and I had this outline for this little essay, and all of these things would relate to one another. And it wasn't a formal outline. It was a scratch outline. And I finally, when I got all of these things down, and I thought, well, I won't forget this stuff, so I could go to sleep. And then it was a couple of days before I could get to work on it, and I started writing, and I began at the beginning, well, where was I born, and all this, and a little bit about the place, and I was working toward Doodlebug. I was working toward the story, the anecdote of the. Well, before I knew it, I was 40 pages in, and I hadn't gotten to the doodlebug yet, let alone the mule and the water witching. And, so I realized I had this book project on my hands. So that's how the book really came about. It's called The Drought Boy, a memoir of my childhood. And it's also about, at one point I go back, I went back to that place. As I say, it was 30 years before I was ready to write about that place. And I went back there to just visit the territory again. I went with my stepson, Reese, and we were going to go canoeing in one of the rivers down in the Ozarks. And while we were there, or when we got there, we'd made arrangements ahead of time. And when we got there, we noticed that the river was a little bit high. And, but we made camp and everything. And we were going to go canoeing the next day. Well, the next day we were on our way to the place where you rent the canoes. It's kind of like canoeing the Niobrara, which is a similar kind of experience. And as we're on our way, An old gentleman with a straw hat pulls over and motions to his wife, and she rolls down the window, sticks his head out and says, "Did they find that Drought boy?" And, you know, I could hear the banjo music playing, you know, Deliverance banjo. Actually, that place in the Current River in Missouri was where they shot parts of Deliverance, the calm parts. It wasn't the wild water parts. But it's that sort of, it's a mountainous terrain and with a river running through it, to borrow a phrase. And so then our trip down the river becomes a kind of narrative which is played off against the background of my own childhood. Yes, I was fortunate to have some encouragement at times when I needed it. Henry Carlisle, a poet who shares my interest in the environment, in the outdoors and wildlife. He's a fisherman and a hunter, and knows everything. You know, he knows all the fish, and as a matter of fact, one time I wrote a poem about salmon in a slough in the Columbia River, and I read the poem, and Henry just sort of had his head in his hands and was trying not to laugh, and he said, "Those weren't salmon, those were carp, Art." That's not salmon at all. He said, "You know, you can write pretty well, but you don't know anything about fish. You should write about what you know." People whose lives and their work, somehow their lives and their work are not separate, and they're part of the same process. However, they at some stages, it's very important to have somebody that you can identify with, a man, a woman, a person who looks like you. But at some point, it's also important, I think, to learn from people whose lives are outwardly somewhat different than yours. One mentor who's meant a lot to me was Madeline DeFries, who taught at Montana, and she was a nun for 30 years, and there's not much way one's experience could be different than ours. Her ability to have self-discipline, her capacity for self-discipline, I was so in awe of it. She seemed so disciplined. She eventually left the convent and lived on her own and pursued her literary career, and eventually retired and now lives in Seattle. But she was maybe more than like a model to me that really taught me in some ways more than the people I sought out as mentors that I thought would be a mentor to me. So mentors come in all shapes and sizes. One of my teachers, Richard Hugo, an interesting way of putting a piece of advice. He said, "Give yourself to form. Give yourself to form." Which meant you write a sonnet or a formal poem. For me, it's most often sonnets that end up working. I have written one sestina and about 80 lines that all tried to be villanelles, but they never turned into one. They never could. Villanelles have repeat lines that repeat much too often. And I have never written anything I liked hearing myself say that much. You know, I just can't do a line that repeats every 4 lines. It just doesn't work for me. A sonnet has a form that has something called the sonnet turn, the volta, often happens between the 8-line top part and the 6-line bottom part, the octave and the sestet. And somebody once said, well, nobody believes that you can ask a question in 8 lines and answer it in 6. That's why nobody writes sonnets anymore. Well, I guess it doesn't have to be question and answer, but it's 2 sides of something. Most recently, on a trip to England, I started a series of sonnets. Each one has a bird, because I like watching birds, and going to a new place is a way to add to your life list. Add new birds to the list of birds you've seen, and so it's new places and new birds. Dunnocks on Norman graves, Lincoln Castle. A schoolboy here to see how King John's seal ate through the Magna Carta, peers downstairs curled inside the tower. My knees have all gone to jam, he says. These stones are theirs who lie beneath them, blanketed with grass, fine as English rain. Above one mound, birds common as the row of council flats built in the moat contend for higher ground. The old names shuffle wing from their display, a shrug to claim their turf. Kings evict. Domesday mentions families sent away, counts an unnamed 166. No wind can starve this rain that still dissolves men and limestone stacked in castle walls. While we were in Britain, we stayed for a while in, or traveled a bit through Wales. This is Guillemots on Cliffs, Holyhead Mountain, Anglesey. Black and white, they look like puffins from the RSPB Tower's telescope. Coins, a deck of 2-toned cards thrown against the wind, their luck prevents the stoop of peregrines from ledges high above. If one survives, 10 die to add black feathers and white flesh to the logic of waves chopping tidal current beyond South Stack. The summit's cairn of whitewashed stone supports biting flies and half-imagined views of Irish peaks. More stones imply the fort cold Romans starved within. Returned, we muse over our scones with whipped cream and jam, how much like God or nature subsists in chance. Well, these are sonnets. I enjam the lines quite a bit and soften or reverse rhythms in the middle sometimes. Playing with Milton's idea of the line as since variously drawn out, that the line breaks shouldn't always be quite obvious. But they are, the form is there. I swear it is. I swear it is. And what I hope is that the sense of the sonnet comes through, the feel of a sonnet, whether in a hearing, whether the exact form is obvious or not. Well, let's play a game. Let's see. This is, well, after I read it, I'll tell you the rhyme words, okay? Okay. This is corncrake in flooded fields at Hundred House. Hundred House is a tiny little village in Wales. And I found a map in a bookstore, and it showed the old stage road from London to Hundred House, which is this little tiny village out in Wales. And this was in June. It was a very wet year. Village paper reports townspeople kept awake 2 nights by calls they couldn't name. I come a week too late to hear its creaks, creaks. A wooden ruler on a comb, my field guide says. The only one in Wales, perhaps, this summer of floods. Farmers wait out in the pub, tense as these scarce rails themselves, over scours and hay going to rot. Jet fighters shave the hills as 2 dogs herd cows, unconcerned at farming change of climate in the sub-Sahara, a dull Jet fighters shave the hills as 2 dogs herd cows, unconcerned at farming change of climate in the sub-Sahara, paired a dull bird's numbers in its summer range, where people live and die between stone walls and sleep in silence older than our laws. These little farmhouses are hundreds and hundreds of years old, these stone farmhouses. Well, the rhyme words. The first stanza is kept, name, crex, and comb. Kept and crex, name, and comb. Whales and rails. Off rhyme with wait and rot. Herd and paired, change and range. And a reverse rhyme of walls and laws. Had to do something with the couplet there. I mean, you get this too, you don't want to be too obvious. Well, another one from right outside Hundred House. A wonderful place. We stayed a little where the sheepdogs lived. Matthew Price's farm. It's called Raven in Matthew Price's Field, Hundred House. The English robin leaves his thistle stalk for gate, then hedge. Matthew says the land means less. Each generation, city folk estrange themselves. Approach the just lambed ewes, and 6 sheepdogs follow. Old man Price shouting them back out of high grass. Ye dirty boogers, where goldfishes ride wind out, clasping a sheaf of seed heads, red faces, orioles around beaks. Though bull raises a gale of grunt and bellow, and afterbirth turns black in morning sun, fierce praise rising like prayer and incense out of earth, raven fans up above his prize, black rag caught in wind's wheel, returns at a walk. I ask myself, what am I doing here? And people ask me, well, what are you doing here? I mean, I say, well, I lived in Oregon, which is, someone's called that ecotopia, right? Yeah. And my mother's family is from Northern California. These are very beautiful places, and places where a lot of people want to live. And they said, what are you doing? And then you lived in Montana, which is being called the last best place. Montana, that's sort of their unofficial motto. And I said, yes, but you can't eat the scenery. And I came here to work. But recently I've gone back to those places, and I found that they've changed. And so it's a matter of that Tom Wolfe, you can't go home again. because it's not home anymore. This is home now. I've lived here for a long time, and it's changed. The place I came from has changed. I've changed. I'm not the same person going back. It's not the same place I'm going to. I can't wait to get home to Nebraska. The land has always interested me, and as I said before, my people interest me, and the relation between people and the land. And I'm getting to know people from all over the place in Nebraska. And it takes a while to get to know a place and the people. And I'm just beginning to put it all together. My friend, Nebraska writer, Jim Brummels, I think has an interesting relationship to the land. He won a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and is now ranching and teaching and writing up near Wayne. And so the lives of people like that, people I've met traveling around the state, and you know, wonderful little enclaves of folks. Some family of farmers, the Divises. You know, isn't that a wonderful name, Divis? It's a Central European name. Neighbors of the Jelineks and the the Kopekis and all these people, these wonderful ethnic enclaves, German, Central European, and they all have different ways of, you know, somebody will refer to all these German farmers around here. They all do this, you know, and so they have their little way of relating to the land, and so I think that relationship between the people and the land in Nebraska, that's the real drama here, I think. You know, it's not the natural beauty and the like of the land isn't you know, it's not immediately picture postcardy, you know, it's not the sweeping vista or something like that, but the drama really comes in the relationship between the people and the land here. I'm always interested in place, the landscape, the land, and now I'm really trying to fit people into this, into the land, and see how people fit in their neighborhoods or on their farms or various places. And I do enjoy listening to people, and so this is pretty much a straight transcription. This happened, and I ran home and tried to get it down as accurately as I could. I recently sent this little piece to an online magazine run by the writer Dinty Moore, who has a little online journal called Brevity. And so I guess sometime this summer it's going to be online. I call it dramatic dogalogue, like a dialogue, but this is, you know, people come up and want to talk to you about your dog. I'm standing outside the supermarket with Hooch, waiting for my wife to pick up a couple of things, when up walks about the fourth elderly woman in a row to say, "What a pretty dog." "Thanks," I say. "He thinks so." "What kind?" she begins, but then corrects herself. "I mean, what do you call this brand of dog?" He's a golden retriever." "I like dogs." "I can see that," I say. "But I'm a widow," she continues, ignoring my impertinence. "And my husband always said, we always lived up on the corner of 55th up here. Well, people don't pay any attention to the stop signs. They just go like I don't know. It's bad enough when they run over the squirrels, but then the Humane Society has to come out and scrape up a dog, or maybe not so much a cat. Oh, if it were my dog, I'd just feel so guilty." "Well, they do take a lot of looking after." I scratch Hooch on the head. He's pulling a little on the leash, trying as he does to get downwind of the stranger the better to evaluate her. She has a broken blood vessel near the corner of her mouth, which is pretty well covered up with makeup, except in the creases. It looks like a spider is hidden in her face. He isn't vicious, is he? I try to sound reassuring. No, he likes people, but he's a male, so with dogs he gets a little. Because my husband was at work, she says, as if I've interrupted again, and he'd get wrapped around the stake, and I'd be afraid to go out there and untangle him. Rawr, rawr, leaping at the chain. Hardly move, poor thing. What kind of dog, I asked. A school teacher, and he didn't get home for 2 hours. I was too afraid. It was a big dog, I tell you, and vicious, not like Lassie on TV. A collie, then, I say, feeling a bit more on solid ground. Yes, but black and brown. But the people come by with all kinds, big and little. I don't know all the brands. Yes, well, they have to be walked so they don't get bored and run away. I would like to have a dog, but are they little when you get them, or do they come this size? Well, dogs are animals, I babble. I mean, they start out. I stop and try again. We got Hooch here from the pound, so he was grown. We haven't had him since he was a puppy. I see. He's a beautiful dog, a beautiful, beautiful dog. She went into the store. Hooch gave me a puzzled look, sighed, and lay down. Good dog, I said. Good dog. Another place, almost a little subgenre itself, is, the little commentary. National Public Radio is responsible for this sort of thing, and Nebraska Nightly does these, and a number of things, a number of national public radio shows do. But so I've been writing. As I say, I'm here. I've been here long enough that I feel like I can sort of write about the place as somebody who belongs, and sort of making a place here. So I'll close with this. Letter to a friend who moved out of state. Dear Neil, how's New York? Allison and I went to the Sandhills last week. Weird thing, all the Sandhills lakes are rising. No one knows why. Department of Interior says 12 years of higher than average rainfall is catching up. Ranchers say the reservoirs are backing it up. Road crews say it's a lot of work replacing those culverts, regrading roads. A gray-haired lady took her 1968 Chevy Biscayne right around those road closed signs, so I fell in behind her. Gosh darn it, the set of her shoulders seemed to say, I've got an appointment at Ruby's hair salon, and I got to get there or she'll make me wait till last. I couldn't keep up. They drive 50 plus on roads that'd make me nervous with four-wheel drive. We have a favorite place in Halsey, the Double T Bar, as in cattle brand, cafe and saloon. It's the only bar or cafe in Halsey. Got there for breakfast after camping in that planted forest down the road. Two guys that looked so much like ranch hands that they were probably park workers were sitting at one table. The door was open, but the lights were awful low, so when the cook poked her head out to catch a little bit of Little House on the Prairie on the TV, Allison asked whether we were too early. Yeah, cook says, but I got to make these guys breakfast anyways. Yep, one of them said, we already made her get the skillet dirty. Come on in. Cook looked like somebody Oprah would love to get her hands on, somebody who'd have plenty to say if anybody'd just listen. They've got cable now, she explained, so she was catching up on Little House when she got a chance, with a hard look at the two at the other table. She asked us what we'd have, and we asked her what she'd got. Well, I ain't got no breakfast menu, just the usual stuff, pretty much. We ordered eggs and hash browns, and she disappeared until she came out with the other guy's breakfast, one of which was an omelet. Well, it ain't much of an omelet, she said. I don't really know how to make omelets, do you? Yes, as a matter of fact, I do, said the omelet man, and made cook mad. Well, then, you should hire out as a cook. make good money, work everywhere. People wants things fancy. That's what everybody wants nowadays. I don't do fancy. We had not ordered fancy, and they came out just right. Eggs over easy, hash browns buttery and crunchy at the same time, toast. I figure such happiness is doomed. They've got cable. Already, Cook admitted once she had settled down from the omelet business, she's seen some of those Little House episodes twice. Soon she'll be phoning Oprah, tuning in to the Gourmet Channel. Soon everything will be fancy. That's the news from way out here in Nebraska. Art. The simplest advice I ever got was from one of my first teachers, Henry Carlisle, who wrote over my work. This is a wonderful journey you've started on. Read like crazy and write your rear end off. And that's probably you read and you write. As far as getting training, one of my other teachers, Richard Hugo, said, a good teacher can save you a lot of time. They can help. It's kind of like one of my students said to me, she said, is this going to be like tennis lessons? And I said, how so? And she said, well, every time I get to a plateau in my tennis playing, I take lessons, and then my game falls apart. It gets much worse because I suddenly know everything I'm doing wrong. But then I do improve later on, but it takes a while. And that it is a painful process, but taking lessons, studying with a writer whose work you respect and would like to emulate, or whose style you would like to approach. Having a writer you respect who can give you feedback on your work is good. And as Richard Hugo said, it can save you a lot of time making all those mistakes yourself and learning yourself where you've made your mistakes. They can point things out, and they can point out your strengths. They can help you to recognize what you do best and where your problems are. Study with a writer you respect and keep at it. I've edited or been asked to review for textbook publishers a number of anthologies of personal essay writing and the like, and yeah, I complain. Isley, amongst other favorite writers, or it's not in there. Like Charles Darwin, I think, is a wonderful essayist. The Voyage of the Beagle, some wonderful writing, whether you call it science writing or essay writing or travel writing or whatever you want to call it. And some of my favorite writers are like the nature writers, and Lauren Isley amongst them. I mean, his little thing, little shorts, his little thing about the catfish hopping out of the pail in The Immense Journey. That's a wonderful little anecdote. It can stand just by itself. So he's a favorite writer, but I don't get to use him because he's not in the anthologies I use. And of course, I wouldn't break copyright laws to write something off. So. It's been suggested that the rise in popularity in the late 20th century of poetry too, especially the short lyric. We don't do long narrative forms. We do short forms. And the short story. There have been a number of people. I mean, major American literary figure and a movement with Raymond Carver, who writes very short stories, and have spawned the sort of idea of minimalism. I don't think the term was his idea. I think it just they needed to think of a term. But that whole movement toward short pieces probably does have something to do with the information age, information overload. Can it fit on a computer screen? Can you read it while you're stuck in a traffic jam? or during one sitting on the toilet, or in the outhouse or whatever. It's I think I mean I think literature does relate to the society around it, and it certainly these realities. It is true. We don't have a lot of time, and we don't spend a lot of time reading, and short forms, they fit the lifestyle. The much predicted end of literacy hasn't happened, and doesn't seem likely to happen. Computers were supposed to be the end of literacy, and it turns out that text is one of the easiest things to transmit over the computer. This little piece here, the letter to a friend out of state, was actually an email. I started writing really to a friend, and what's going, and he'd emailed. So a literary correspondence is picking up, because people are emailing. So it's a little form of its own, these short pieces. As I said, I'm interested in, I'm really trying to get people involved, and my working title of my new piece, or my new collection it has some very long pieces and some very short pieces, because there are still people who write long forms. The writer's name is escaping me now. Basin and Range, John McPhee, writes very long pieces that are like serialized in New Yorker and things like that. Waiting for a Ship, another one of his, Into the Country, about Alaska, about sailors, about Western America, Basin and Range. Yeah, I've been writing some really long pieces. Recently finished one going back to where my family's from, in the Ozarks, where they're having a kind of a set to. It turns out that in some of the national parks there's wild horses running around free, and the Park Service wants to round them up because they're worried about their effect on the landscape. They're not native. Well, the locals, of course, you can't round up wild horses anywhere in the United States since The Misfits was made, Nobody likes it because people realize that there isn't anything to do with those horses. They're not going to be adopted, and if they're not slaughtered, they're going to be put into a corral someplace where they will languish and die, or live a long time in a really rotten conditions. So nobody's happy about that. Nobody wants that to happen. So there was a big fight down there about what to do with these horses. I was down there writing about the local folks' attitude about this, and because it made strange. Suddenly, you had people who were like, hunters and people who kill their own pigs and whatever, and they're suddenly becoming tree huggers or horse huggers, it's like, spare that horse, standing out there. And there's the Park Service with people who got into got into the Park Service because they love the environment and they love nature and everything, saying, shoot them, so we have these people on opposite sides of the, that they're playing out the odd roles. Both highly emotionally charged roles. So it turned out to be a long kind of investigative piece. This thing went all the way to the Supreme Court. My piece is called Poets and Poachers, Pot Hunters and Population. That's my working title. It's about, because all sorts of people come, I'm finding, come in, from lady in the parking lot to poets to poachers and odd sorts. Well, I thank you all very much for coming tonight. Good night.